Hello and welcome to Off My Shelves, and this is another episode of Destroying the To Be Read Pile. This is for the month of October, so let's get underway. So I'm just going to get up Goodreads as per usual here. If you haven't already, check out September and previous months and things like that. We have been going through most of the months now and nearly fully caught up with everything. Basically, because I'm in November recording this, all I have to do is record this October one and I am fully back on track with updating normally at the end of every month or beginning of the next. I started off the month by reading Batman by Brian Azzarello and Eduardo Risso. This is a collection of stories all revolving around that creative pair, and mainly is Broken City. And Broken City is one of those unique Batman stories. I think it's not going to be to everyone's taste. Essentially, it feels like an Elseworld story. I think it's probably out of continuity then and now, but double check on that because I'm no expert on that type of thing. But essentially, it's bringing in characters like Killer Croc, who hasn't converted into a crocodile scaly thing yet, but he does like chomping down on people and things. A killing happens and Batman begins to investigate this killing, and he's quite flummoxed by who done it and how it happened and all that type of thing. So it's just him, strong arming the people around and trying to bring people into line to figure out who killed who and what happened, and then trying to find a person that's gone into hiding because they have information and everyone's after them. So it's quite a straightforward, detective story. I think a lot of the annoyances are going to come with the reveal of who is a murderer and who killed certain people in the story. That bit, I don't know, it felt like it was a pointless kind of addition that didn't really push the narrative too much forward. It was just like, oh, okay. The artwork in here was pretty good. I have mixed opinions on Eduardo Risso's artwork. Like 100 Bullets, for example, it should be like called 100 Hard Nipples. He was just obsessed with drawing like bullet nipples on every girl on every page, and it just drove me mad. Like every page, like it was just like another girl in a skimpy top with bullet nipples. So I have mixed opinions on his artwork, but it is this weird middle ground of Mignola and Frank Miller and things like that. But there is a lot of strengths in Broken City story arc. Other story arcs in the book, one shots are okay. Some of them are more interesting than others, but in general, it was just an okay book. I'm never going to be blown away by it. And in fact, Brian Azzarello's work in general, I've only ever really liked the Wonder Woman story arc, and I've read quite a lot of his other work, and nothing has really hit in the same way that has at all. And so whether that's to do with Cliff Chang being on art in Wonder Woman, I have no idea, but ultimately, that's the only Brian Azzarello story arc that I've really loved. I have recently bought Joker and Luther, so I'm going to see if that is different in any way. But this was a fine Batman story, but there are better out there, to be fair. Then Usagi Yojimbo Volume 39, Ice and Snow, and I read the trade paperback of the continuing adventures of Usagi Yojimbo. I was a little bit scared, I should say, because IDW's last issues and kind of some of the story arcs were a few of the weaker Usagi Yojimbo story arcs. There was also a bit of confusion with colorists, a bit of different approaches going on there, I think, and one colorist leaving and then the replacement being a mixed bag. And then one or two continuity issues with some of the story arcs, like I think in Tengi story arc in IDW, he's got a hook for a hand, but there's several pages that he's got a hand instead of his hook. And for a person who enjoys and is so absorbed in Usagi's world like I am, things like that matter and stick out a lot. And so I was worried the quality was dipping. I had nothing to worry about, because as soon as this story arc began, I was just overwhelmed by how strong it was. Some really good issues of Usagi, to be fair. Usagi is still with Uchi, going through the mountainous landscape after the IDW story arc finished. They were left in this snowy landscape, and they're working their way through there. They meet a few demons, as you do in this book. You meet a few demons who try to eat you, and you combat them and kill them. But all the while, the big bad is the return of Jay, and Jay getting a band of criminals together to hunt down Usagi and finally kill him in this, barren landscape. which was great. Paced really well, you know, you knew the conflict was coming, but then Jay was doing his thing and Usagi was doing his thing, and then they were both going to inevitably meet and clash, and when they did, it was loads of fun. And then even in the aftermath, when Usagi and Uchi visited some villages, there was still more demon fun going on there. If you like the more demon, fantastical, supernatural Usagi stories, then this is going to be right up your street, because it genuinely is wall-to-wall demon fights, you know, people trying to eat Usagi, and a snowy backdrop. Fantastic stuff. I read Slain the Horned God, the anniversary edition, a massive, beautiful book. And I had high expectations from this book because the artwork by Simon Beasley was insane good. Particularly the colouring, and I don't know if this edition was recoloured, but the colouring on it was astounding. And yeah, it was a really interesting read, I thought. Pat Mills as a writer is always doing humorous things in his writing. He's very much kind of obsessed with not taking things too seriously and playing that fine line between seriousness and humour, and not really going down either road with much force, just playing on both sides of that road. And Slain is very much that as well. You know, it's this Conan-like character who is trying to unify the warring tribes of Britain and things like that, and is trying to bring together these artifacts to take over a position of power and become the new Horned God, because the Horned God is the goddess's servant or representative on Earth, and he basically has just betrayed the goddess and things like that. And so Slain is now going out of his way to unify the tribes and to bring these artifacts that they all have given from the goddess to them and bring them all together to be even more powerful. The story is being told by this little horrible kind of dwarf-like creature, and yeah, he's weird and wonderful, but equally the narrative gets strange because the narration is someone reading his writing and then making comments on his writing, saying stuff like, oh, in this part he fixated on talking endlessly about the woman's physique, so we'll skip over that bit and get to the next bit. So again, there's a lot of humour in the narration, and it never takes things quite seriously, to be fair. It is brutal in places in the battles, but there is not as much action as you might think. It is paced to be really bottom heavy with the action, so the final battle scenes and everything are just, you know, all out chaos and carnage. Slain as a character is pretty much one dimensional, which isn't a bad thing. It's fine. He basically is, you know, a burly man who's going out to, you know, fight a battle and wants to honour the goddess and do right by her. He's got a child, he's got an ex-relationship, all that plays into the story arc and these warring tribes. What was really good is each tribe had its own unique history and heritage and style of dress and style of fighting. I loved that, and so the world building was really good, but the lack of, you know, action was a bit jarring because I was expecting more action. Instead of the action, what's replaced by that is those conversations between the other tribes and building up this world. And I did enjoy it, but I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I might. The artwork was definitely the biggest draw, and at times I wish that Pat Mills would have taken the story a little bit more serious. But again, I do enjoy Pat Mills's humorous writing, particularly like in Nemesis the Warlock and other things like that. I think it could have been improved, but equally I can see why people really like it. I think the art is what really pushes this into a league of its own, and the imagination behind it, the colouring, the whole way it's set up and it dominates a page is just fabulous. You could just literally just look at this book and go, this is an amazing book, and not read a single page, and then when you read it you go, it's not as good as I thought it might be. But again, it is what it is. I think other people might disagree with me, but I certainly think it had room for improvement on the writing side of things. Similar thing was Fantagraphics published or republished The Farewell Song of Marcel Lebrun. This started off really well, but then the second story arc contained in it was so obnoxious that I really didn't like it too much at all. Essentially what we've got is like an Italian comic from from late 20th century, I think he wrote it. And it's sort of this James Bond-like character, but he's more of a journalist, or with military training and things like that. And it's in wartime in Beirut, so the setting was really interesting because the setting itself is not one that's been used. Very similar in some ways to Casablanca in that wartime setting, and this Humphrey Bogart like character being the guy who knows who to get to and how to get it on the site. And this is similar because in Beirut in 1941, an American actress, millionaire woman comes on the scene, and she is suspected of being a spy. Marcel is then employed to discover more about her by the Germans, because he's almost like a journalist, private detective for hire, really. And he starts investigating that. But then generally there's a love story that develops between the two, and they eventually realise that Carol is there to help assist certain people get across the border into Palestine. And so you've got this very intriguing story about a guy who hasn't got many morals at all, who's quite a womanizer, who's quite obnoxious, falling for this girl who's very passionate about fighting for these moral and justifiable causes and helping these people. And so he's being brought in there. And that whole narrative was really good. It was a good story in general. I enjoyed it. The artwork was really good as well. All black and white, nice strong line artwork, I think. And so the next story arc catches up with him, and he's basically a POW, a prisoner of war. And it's a story of him escaping and then hiding out and then going to different places. Obviously, I don't want to spoil anything too much, which I am being quite broad. The problem with this story is, like, early on he's like hitting the head and he's a bit out of it, and some of the stuff he says and the way he approaches it and some of the characterization of women in particular, whereas it was almost bordering on being a bit obnoxious in the first story arc, it is fully like obnoxious and misogynistic in the second. I mean, to the point where there's a main character in the second story arc who has a large chest. They basically call her, Golden Chest for the entire thing. She doesn't even get a name. Her name is Golden Chest. So I don't know if it was their version of trying to play on, the James Bond tropes of like pussy galore and all that type of thing. But it was just a bit awkward, and the story arc really dwindled on, and it didn't have the same pacing and the same intrigue as the first story arc. So the first story definitely is worth a look. The second one, I don't know, I'd give it a wide berth. It isn't the best, I don't think. Hellboy, The Bones of Giants, which is a standalone, well, it was individual issues, but now it comes out in these little standalone hardbacks from Dark Horse. This was such a fun story. I loved this. I love Hellboy, obviously, but this was loads of fun. They find a body with a hammer, Mjolnir, and this hammer then gets picked up by Hellboy, and it gets fused to Hellboy's right hand of doom, and so everything kind of starts from there, really, and bodies of frost giants start being recreated. And it's wonderful because there's a character from a very early short story of Hellboy who's reintroduced here, and they give him more of a fleshed out story, give him family members, but push that character even further down the route that he started out in that original story. And this is very much Hellboy in that Nordic mythological world where there's an impending threat from the frost giants and things like that. It was loads of fun. The artwork by Matt Smith was wonderful, and I loved every bit of it. There was nothing to dislike about this book. It didn't outstay its welcome. It was fun and interesting. Obviously, if this is your first Hellboy book, you might not enjoy it as much, because I think knowing a bit about the backstory of one or two of the characters that they introduce or reintroduce in it helps push it to be in a bit more of a detailed story. But in general, I loved this. Loads of fun. Explorers of the Moon, Tintin's next story. Tintin's next story after Destination Moon. Now, this was far better than Destination Moon because it stopped going on and on about how things are made and how engines are created and the process of building the rocket and stuff like that. It basically got on with it. They get to the moon, they land on the moon, they investigate. There's some issues getting in there, really. But in general, the whole book, I was just like, why is this country sending a drunk sailor and a kid Tintin, who's a bit older than a kid, I suppose, up in space. I don't get it. I don't get why this is happening. I don't get why they would spend so much money and send just inept people up. But either way, that's how it happened, and it was much more fun because it basically just, travelled around the moon. It didn't bring in any, fantastical elements like aliens or anything like that, which I appreciated. It did approach it in the same scientific way that it approached the other volume, Destination Moon. And so it was much more fun, and it had much more of a good direction through it. They arrive on the moon, their journey is a bit disruptive, there's saboteurs there, and then they have to leave and get back. So there was a clear kind of line, whereas Destination Moon was just all over the place, I thought. Diego Rivera, a graphic biography published by Self-Made Hero, one of the Art Masters publications, phenomenal, by Jose Luis Pescador. It was absolutely wonderful, the artwork in this book. Stunning beyond belief. The colouring, the way the page is structured, the inventiveness of it all. It's a real hard work to get the artwork to sing on the page, because there's a tendency for the art to tell that story in a chronological way almost. Because if you want to tell a historically accurate story, then you tell it. But then if you're telling it by art, you've got this way of creating far more diversity and creativity on the page, so you can tell that story in the text boxes, but the artistry you can do a bit more with, because the story is there. The art can invest a different emotional feel in it, and this is what this book did. Definitely, it really created a very layered person's life and just laid it out in a really interesting way. The writing is fabulous as well by Francisco de la Mora. Wonderful writing, a really interesting artist on every level, because he didn't have the same trajectory as most artists. So it starts off telling you about his youth and about his father being a rebellious person and being persecuted in their village and stuff like that for wanting, communistic traditions to come into play. His disillusionment with communism growing up, which was relentless and horrible. But any aspect of his life at all, it lays it all down, and you basically will finish it thinking, well, he was a right knob, but he was incredibly talented. A person that's quite obnoxious and quite horrible into a character that you want to find out more about, tells you about how good the story has been interpreted and how good the story is in general about this human being, and about him, painting these amazing works of art and murals, and his relationship with Frida Kahlo. You get stories about him going to, communist Russia and being involved with loads of those movements, but then again, his politics changing and evolving over time. It's a really varied biography, and I really enjoyed it. I went into it not knowing a great deal about Diego Rivera. I knew more about his wife more than anything else, but it was a wonderful way to discover more about this artist. Straightforward biography, doesn't jump about too much, but because the artwork is so interesting and strong, it just made it all very wonderful in every level. I think it's well worth picking up and reading, particularly if you like non-fiction biographies and learning more about artistic methods and how certain famous artists came to be what they would become. Then it's great. I read Neil Gaiman Library Volume 2, and these are library editions collecting individual story arcs of from Neil Gaiman and other collaborative artists, and they come in 3 volumes. This is Volume 2. I read Volume 1 ages ago, and I just haven't got around to reading Volume 2 and 3, but I read Volume 2, and the first 2 story arcs, which were... The first story arc was looking at a pub and looking at people's lives connected to that pub, and it was very much this kind of ghost story vibe. And so I fell into reading it in October, because ultimately it was, a perfect spooky read, really. The first story arc was snippet stories of people that occupied this very strange and unique London pub. First part of that story arc was a guy just being convinced that he's being, taken over by another being, but that someone is taking over his body. Then so it starts off with him thinking he's got like an STD, looking and investigating that, and then his whole body changing, and you never quite know what's going on. But the way the story is paced and told, you're always like, what is going on? And you want to turn the page to find out what the hell is actually going on. And when you get to the end, you're just like, oh, it's a ghost story. There's something going on. There's something weird happening. And then there's a another great story about a lady living opposite a gentleman, being ageless in many ways and eating flesh off animals and things like that to prolong her life. Really, ghost type stories. The next story was called The Troll, and that was wonderful. I really liked that story a lot. The artwork was phenomenal in it. Yeah, the first story arc was named Likely Stories. The second story arc was named The Troll, and The Troll was my favourite in this. This was worth the price of entry alone, I think, because it takes that very well-known story of a troll living under a bridge and preying on people trip-trapping over his bridge. It takes that story and develops it in a really interesting way. A child finds this bridge and the troll appears and says that he's going to eat him, and the child, convinces the troll that he hasn't lived his life yet. And so the troll thinks, okay, I'll leave you live longer, and then when I eat you later on, you'll be a better meal because you've lived a bigger, longer life. Things happen and he ends up being back there as like early 20s, teenager, whatever, and he convinces himself to get out of it again. And so the third time that he gets there, it plays out a bit differently, I'll say that, but it was a really interesting take on the troll under the bridge story, and I really enjoyed it a lot. Harlequin Valentine and the Facts in the Case of the Departure of Miss Finch were the last two stories. These were pretty ropey. Harlequin Valentine started off intriguing, but the artwork, because it's this collage mashup type art style, it wasn't really for me at all. And so the story of this character nailing his heart to the door and proclaiming his love for this woman who lived there, but her not being able to see this mysterious, powerful being that's following her, was intriguing. But equally, it didn't really do anything much for me in the slightest. It was all right, but I didn't like the artwork, and the story was just about okay. It was a little bit more annoying than anything else because the main character was so annoying and so, loving the sound of his own voice and declaring his love for this woman. But then the twist in it was pretty good, but ultimately it was forgettable, I think. The last story is probably one of the most self-indulgent, annoying stories I've ever read. It places Neil Gaiman on a night out with Jonathan Ross and his wife Jane, and they bring along a friend who's Miss Finch, and they go to this underground circus, and they basically go through different rooms and get entertained in different ways. But every time they go forward, more and more strange things happen, and then stuff happens to Miss Finch, and it is so annoyingly self-indulgent about, look at me, Neil Gaiman, going out on these fantastic nights out with Jonathan Ross and his wife Jane, and we're out seeing these very unique underground entertainment things around London. It was just a load of old shit, to be honest. I did not like it at all. Then I read Madame Choi and the Monsters, a true story of Madame Choi and the Monsters. This came out recently by Patrick Spiat and Cherie Domingo, the illustrator, and this is an amazing story, I thought. It's a true story of a film actress being taken prisoner by the North Korean government and being made to be part of the North Korean film industry. Her husband, the director, is kidnapped later on and forced to become part of it, and she was there for decades. I mean, it's a bonkers story, and it's really told in the bare bones, so it goes through the events leading up to her kidnapping and then her time there, but it doesn't spend too much time and protracted time on what she actually got up to there. It's very much the beginning and the end of that whole narrative. So you see her getting kidnapped, you see her then escaping and trying to find a life outside of that. So they purposefully don't really focus overly on the in-between. There is parts of it that show you that, but generally it's more focused on how she got there and how she got out. Then in between, they retell this mythological type story about a castle and a king dominating the area, and about a woman and trying to find her blacksmith's husband and making this monster to try and take back her community and her people. That is very much it's weird when it starts, because you're like, what has this got to do with the main story? It's basically a kind of warning parable, almost mixed up with the story, that is adapted from a traditional North Korean or South Korean story. And yeah, it's a lovely story within a story, but you can link it to the meaning of the overall arc as well if you wanted to, or if you just wanted to enjoy it as a story, then you're more than happy to. The artwork I found really fun and really straightforward. It wasn't overly complicated, but it was really fun. I really enjoyed reading it, and yeah, it was a good book. Really quick read as well. Next was Kiss the Sky, Volume 1, Jimi Hendrix, 1942 to 1970, by Jean-Michel Dupont and Mezzo. Artwork-wise, this is a phenomenal one. Now, I read the English translation of this. I think it was originally out in French, and Black Panel Press translated it and brought it to the English market. Now, I don't want to say too much about this because I am planning on doing a video on Black Panel Press, this and 2 other of their books, because they're a smaller publisher that maybe many people haven't heard of, but I've had some really nice reading experiences from them. So I'm going to definitely do a video talking about this and 2 other books that I read recently. So I'll keep it quite brief with this. It's Jimi Hendrix's story from child to when he gets on the plane to come to London. And anyone who knows the story of Jimi Hendrix knows that when he comes a solo artist to London, that's where his career kind of kicked into another gear entirely. It really formed the Jimi Hendrix that everybody knows and is familiar with, really. So his childhood is obviously full of harsh realities, and his parents have got their own issues in many ways. But the book deals with this all in such a straightforward manner. It doesn't belittle moments, or it doesn't enlarge them to be in kind of, moments where the hero was born, where Jimi Hendrix, the legend, was born. It just says it all really as a matter of fact. So it just goes through beat by beat the major points of his childhood, then his teens, then early adulthood, going into his 20s, and then ending up, as like I said, going on that plane to come to Britain to change his fortunes, and that's where the book ends. This is a great addition, I think, because it's a straightforward, factual biography of his life growing up. It delves into how lazy he was, how he was being late for everything and getting sacked, and how he had the personality of being very much a dreamer. I loved it. The production of this book was phenomenal as well from Black Panel Press. Lovely cloth-bound spine, foiled kind of Kiss the Sky on the front. A really strong book design, and I'll talk more about Black Panel Press in another video. Foregathered on Christmas Eve is a short story. It's only about 60 or 70 pages long, really. And it brings together Becky Coolhan, Mike Mignola, Jack Haran, and Eric Powell. Now, Eric Powell is the main creative force behind this. He draws and writes the first 2 opening 2 stories, and essentially it follows this Victorian tradition of creative people gathering together on a particular night. Sometimes it was, a random night, sometimes it was Halloween, and sometimes it was Christmas Eve and things like that, and they would tell ghost stories. There's sections of the book that are literally the 4 artists and writers gathered together in a Victorian room. Their faces, visually recreated by Eric Powell there, and their real names being used as well. And they are challenging each other to come up with a ghost story. And then it goes into each of the 4 ghost stories as you go through. It's a nice fun read. There's some stories that are better than others. I think Mike Mignola's story visually is amazing, but writing-wise is a little bit of a letdown in comparison to others in it, because it retells the story of the Jabberwocky from Lewis Carroll, and while it's fun and great to see more Mignola artwork, it is probably the weaker story out of the whole book. Eric Powell's story is really good. Becky Coolhan does a really good story. James Haran just draws a story, and Eric Powell writes a story. And so they're all pretty good. It's like picking up a long-form prestige comic book. You read it and it starts and finishes before you know it. So it's kind of like, you've got an opinion on it, but ultimately you're never going to spend hours and hours talking about it, because it's just a fun one-shot comic where these creators have got together and had a bit of fun coming up with short stories about ghosts and setting them in the Victorian period predominantly. So yeah, it was fun. Then finally, volume 1, 2 and 3 of Zelda Twilight Princess manga. I got the box set recently and read volumes 1 to 4 before falls into November, so we'll talk about that another time. Volumes 1, 2 and 3, and this was great. The artwork by Akira Himikawa, this pairing of 2 mangaka women, is great. They really have created another unique visual art style to Zelda, because all the Zeldas, even though they're all done by the same pairing, they all look unique. They've approached it in the same way the games have. All Zelda games have that unique look about them in some way. Some not so much, obviously, if they use the same game engines and stuff like that. But ultimately, they've all got a distinctive visual representation, and the books are similar to that. So this artwork in this one is a little bit more hard, a little bit more grown up, a little bit more imposing and gothic in places. And Twilight Princess story is the same. The opening story arc really lays down the foundation to the Twilight and to the light realm where Link and Zelda and all that live, and the Twilight realm where Midna and Zant and all these other characters live, and the two being, you know, part of the same universe, but equally the Twilight being used and abused by the people in the light realm, because they send, like, they discarded, you know, bad people there to be, you know, imprisoned forever, and they resent that a little bit. Bazant in the Twilight realm tries to usurp power from Midna, and then the story begins, and Link is running away from a problem. And again, I quite like this because it gives Link a bit more backstory. It outlines that he's running away from his village for a specific reason that links in with the overarching story as well. But it gives a good purpose as to why he's a bit tentative and scared to jump in, because he's got a bit of guilt as what happened prior, and he's almost hiding out in this village backwater, but the action finds him regardless, and now he's got this task of being the goddess's hero and going out and repelling the Twilight, killing Zant, and getting on with business of being amazing hero time and all that type of thing. Super quick read, really fun artwork, real impressive how they filled in gaping gaps in the storyline, but equally I very much like how they've taken characters that almost in the game just grunt and groan and don't really do much of anything, and given those characters a character. Like, for example, the character in the game that Link has a duel with on one of the bridges, he doesn't really say much of anything at all in the games, but in the book he's quite a vindictive, weird, psychotic person who takes a liking to one of the human girls and things like that. So he gets a very different, you know, presentation in this book than he does the game, and that's the type of reason I like these books. It's because it's like revisiting that game world but seeing different aspects of it in a different way, in different format. And yeah, and I'm going to continue reading on. There's 11 in the set. I've already read 4. I'm going to crack on and keep reading, and yeah, that is all I read for October. Hopefully you've enjoyed watching this video and I am caught up. Yay! See you at the end of November for November's read. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you on the next one.